Yeah! Welcome to the Gilded Age. Shout out to Grimshaw. Representing 602. Suckers! Yeah! I get paid every day and I'm cold rough for getting this money.
Many historians argue about the time period in America during the late 19th century. Some believe it was a golden age because of the economic growth spurt, and others argue it was a gilded age because of the uneven growth in different areas of society and the economy. In the South, it was never a question that the South was in a gilded age of old ideas, of racial biases, and the rejection of Northern ideas. The South was behind the rest of the country in every way. The reconstruction of the Southern states was taking much longer than the North anticipated, and a lot more money. In 1874, the Democratic Party won the majority in the House for the first time and had thoroughly reinstated itself in the United States government. In the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, ran against Sam Tilden, Democrat. Hayes won the election because of the compromise between Republicans and Democrats. The compromise was simple. Hayes would win the election if the federal troops in the South were withdrawn. This election shows that our future president, along with the Republican Party, was willing to throw away reformation and progress in the South in order to win an election. After the election, the Redeemers arose in the South. They were a group dedicated to the restoration of the old ways of the South, thoroughly bringing an end to the Reconstruction period. The Democratic state governments lowered taxes in the South and went back to social conservatism. The focus of this post-Reconstruction period was to develop the industrial economy. That is what the New South was, a place of progress in economy. The New South, however, was actually going back to the conservative mindset of segregation and white supremacism instead of progressing with the rest of America. Progress was not made in matters involving racism. Though the railroad manufacturing increased significantly and soon the South was connected with the rest of America. However, the economy of the South had just regained what it had before the war, and the South was still not doing as well as the North was economically. These actions led to the rise of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a system of laws focused on racial discrimination towards blacks and political and civil segregation. Jim Crow brought the stereotypical image of African Americans as incapable peoples who were by no means equal to whites. Jim Crow shows the shallow mindset of the South and sheds a light on the time period as a Gilded Age in regard to the ancient views of race. Some blacks at this time in the South prospered to the middle class by owning businesses or land, and these blacks supported the idea of black colleges for education. Among these men were Booker T. Washington, the founder of the Tuskegee Institute. Washington was a black man who gave many speeches to mixed groups. In the Atlanta Compromise, he addressed blacks about self-sufficiency and becoming economically important so that whites would in fact pay attention to them. He addressed whites about casting your bucket where you are. Whites in the South were very racist, and when shop owners or families needed workers and maids for labor, most of the South preferred hiring white immigrants coming in from Europe over local black residents already there. Washington told whites to use their resources. Though Washington had racial ideas, as well as Webb Du Bois, their messages were going in one ear and out the other of racists in the South. Another very famous black leader at the time was Webb Du Bois. Du Bois was the first African American to go to Harvard for a PhD in history. He did not agree with Washington's belief of accepting discrimination at the time, and then later achieving economic gain. Du Bois hated segregation and believed in gathering resources, and that equality did not have to be earned but should be given to African Americans. He was the editor of the NAACP. This movement challenged segregation and sought to end this discrimination in employment, voting, and transportation. This organization showed progress in that people were taking a stand against this inequality of races. But the difficulty of this task showed how the majority of white people in the South were not willing to abandon their ancient beliefs and prejudices. On June 7, 1892, a black man was arrested for sitting in a white car on a train instead of the colored car. The reason? The Separate Car Act, which legally separated whites and blacks in different cars on trains. This was Plessy versus Ferguson. The verdict of this case stated that separating whites and blacks into separate cars was in fact constitutional if they were equal. This idea of separate but equal swept through the South, endorsing the segregation of whites and blacks in all areas of life, restrooms, schools, theaters, etc. In truth, Things were not separate but equal. In 1890, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, who served as a Republican representative in the House of Representatives, authored a bill by the name of the Federal Elections Bill. This bill protected African Americans' voting rights. Unfortunately, Southern Democrats found many loopholes in which to take down the bill to ensure it was not passed. The Democrats were successful. Lodge was a progressive and liberal thinker who wanted to ensure the equality of races. But racism was still so prominent that it often prevented much progress. And once again, racism won the battle. What to take away? In the 19th century following Reconstruction, it was a time of inequality and conservative ideology in the South, in which little progress was made socially.
The Comstock Act of 1873 banned all, quote, articles of immoral nature, or any drug or medicine, or any article whatever for the prevention of conception or procuring of abortion, end quote. After the Civil War, there was a small conservative push among the population. The Comstock Act utilized post offices in attempts to suppress circulation of obscene materials. This act specifically targeted contraceptives. The act also banned abortions as well as the education of these resources. This kept women from freedom of sexual choices as well as pushing many to dangerous and harmful back alley abortions. The act was named for Anthony Comstock, an infamous social reformer of the Reconstruction era. He brought it upon himself to convict those who were in violation of the act. This reformer was interested in appearance and reputation, as he once boasted of prosecuting approximately 4,000 people. The New Woman refers to the idealized middle to upper class woman living specifically in cities. These women were those who wanted to break out and start movements. However, this idea of the New Woman was strangled greatly by the female sphere into which they were put. Many men did not support the New Woman, and so many females felt they needed to retreat to their traditional roles. Many ideas of the New Woman were purely superficial. Fashion statements and fads such as bloomers and split skirts were connected to the idea of the New Woman, which only represents the sexism within the movement. It implies that if women were to begin a movement, they must have something like clothing involved. Beginning in 1861, a string of women's colleges were opened, and eventually, the majority of colleges in the nation accepted women. Despite the many schools opening to women, constrictions on women's job types after college were present, and this is why, by the 1880s, 80% of school teachers were women. Men controlled the society and the job types. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is an example of how feminism is set on the back burner. The WCTU began to focus on abstaining from alcohol. However, it almost succeeded as a feminist movement as well, until the president of it died and the idea of feminism within the WCTU was forgotten. In fact, because of the WCTU's mild support for the suffrage movement in the early 1890s, and then the abandonment of the suffrage movement, the feminists were hated by the alcohol industry, giving them only more enemies.
By the Gilded Age, millions of immigrants were flooding the U.S. The old immigrants who came in 1880s immigrated mostly from the British Isles and Northern Europe. They were well educated and fit pretty well in the American society. On the contrary, the new immigrants coming around the 1900s were from Southern and Eastern Europe, came in massive numbers, were mostly unskilled, and resisted to the idea of Americanization by living in secluded societies. Due to immigration in large quantities, they caused overpopulation and created slums. Because of the non-stop migration, the people all had to eventually live in tenements, which are cramped, filthy, disgusting small apartments, which often contained health hazards like diseases and rats. By around 1900, two-thirds of New York were living in these atrocious houses. This increased poverty and led to poor city services, which affected not only immigrants but America as a whole. During this age, America was a place full of opportunity, which attracted people who were in the search for better jobs, opening competition for resources. The immigrants took away the jobs of the American people who were struggling, so why bring people from other countries when you could use your own? With more and more immigrants taking the jobs of the unemployed people, the country now became full of them. This reduced the total wealth of the country. Henry Cabot Lodge was a senator who was against immigration. He restricted immigration by helping pass the National Origins Act of 1924, which discriminated against immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. He believed that the U.S. was not ready and did not have the resources to let in all these newcomers, and strongly believed they were a threat to economical and cultural foundations. The Chinese were also an important migration group. They migrated in very large groups to mostly California. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was issued. It prohibited the immigration of Chinese for 10 years. Because they came in enormous groups, even the other immigrants were afraid that they would take their jobs, especially because they would work for smaller wages. Overall, as a consequence of uncontrolled immigration, the Americans had to share their wealth and their jobs with the people who were less skilled, creating tremendous economical and social issues.
The Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 gave land for the use of colleges of agriculture and mechanical arts to help start agricultural careers. These careers came with new concerns, such as declining crop prices, an increase of farmers in debt, the sporadic rate system in freights, and the diminishing amount of available land for new farms. A group called the National Grange talked about these problems and got a series of laws passed which regulated long and short-haul discrimination and other abuses against farmers, such as crop prices. By setting an artificial price, you discouraged competitive market pricing. For example, if cotton prices are fixed, clothing manufacturers will have to pay more, making the consumer pay more. Without the competitive markets, the prices will be unfair to the consumer. The concerns for railroad workers were raised and were similar to those of the National Grange. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was passed to establish the Interstate Commerce Commission, a federal regulatory group that made sure prices were fair and investigated railroads management. However, it was not very successful in completing its goals. The ICC could only sue in court and could not actually regulate prices on their own. Therefore, it had no real impact on railroad practices. Railroad companies also established pools and trusts. Pools decided a fixed price between firms, and trusts, which were people who dealt with the affairs of competing companies. This cuts competition, which is not good for the consumer. When you cut competition, the pricing can be whatever the pool wants, which is unfair to the consumers. Pools and trusts give too much power to the manufacturers and not enough power to the consumers. Another way to combat competition in the late 19th century was to create big businesses by vertical or horizontal integration. Vertical integration was having all the means necessary to manufacture a product. This would avoid middlemen and control an industry. Although you will have all the pieces to manufacture your good, you might not be as efficient as possible. It may be more cost-effective just to buy the finished product from an outside company than making all the parts yourself. Also, you might not make the product as well as the other companies who specialize in making the product. Horizontal integration was a taking over of another company that produces the same product as you and is at the same phase of process. This will consolidate all the products and allow for a monopoly of an industry. The monopoly of an industry would again discourage competitive market pricing, creating high prices for the consumer. However, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 authorized federal action against any combination in the form of trust or otherwise or conspiracy and restraint of trade. Antitrust acts prevented against big companies. Big companies sometimes need to be big to compete in a global economy with other big companies in the world. Without the big companies, other countries could have the upper hand on products. Also, the language of the act was so vague that the act proved almost impossible to enforce.
Susan B. Anthony was a famous feminist who fought for the right of women to vote. Susan B. Anthony is on the United States coin. It's called the Susan B. Anthony coin and is worth $1. She was the first woman to be honored in this way. Anthony partnered with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and tried to get newly accepted amendments, like the 15th Amendment, changed so that they included women. Anthony had a battle with Congress to pass the suffrage amendment, but Congress won that battle and refused. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was another famous feminist with similar accomplishments to Anthony. She was active in the Women's New York Temperance Society, which was an organization of women who opposed alcohol. She also was involved in women's equality and spoke to New York legislature about passing an act that gave women the right to their own property, and saw women and men as separate legal entities when married. They could both sell and buy their own property. Stanton ran for Congress in 1866 as an independent candidate. She was the first woman to run for Congress. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was a famous professor, poet, and author. He wrote many medical novels like Elsie Venner, which is the story of a pregnant woman getting bitten by a snake and her child being half human and half snake. The goal of the story is to question the idea of original sin. Churches found this novel to be heretical. One of his most famous essays was The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table, which was a conversation between the autocrat and his friends at the breakfast table. Mary Baker Eddy was an author, teacher, and religious leader who became popular for her idea of Christian Science, an idea of health and spirituality. In 1866, she became injured after falling on an icy sidewalk. While injured, she turned to the Bible and read about Jesus' healing. After reading this, she found herself to be well again. This is the moment that she discovered Christian Science. She wrote a book called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures about her system of healing and her discovery of Christian Science. It was published in 1875. Christian churches weren't accepting of her healing system, so she started her own church, called the Church of Christ, Scientists. The social gospel was a movement that used biblical teachings to solve problems with industrialization and social issues. Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch spearheaded this movement out of fear that religion would be isolated to the working class. They believed in social progress and goodness of humanity. In all of this social reconstruction, the poor, children, and women were all benefited, but the blacks were never mentioned or supported. The Gospel of Wealth was an idea by Andrew Carnegie, who was a wealthy man, so he gave his money to projects that would benefit society, like funding libraries. He thought that by sharing his wealth with the poor, it would bind the social classes together. He did this because he saw the enormous change in living between the lower classes and the higher classes. The rich were living with better environments, schools, and opportunities, while the poor couldn't even make it through high school to get a job and try to improve their lives. Carnegie thought that this was a great idea because it was helping everyone, but what he didn't realize was that this was a great opportunity for the poor to. Social Darwinism is a theory proposed by Charles Darwin saying all people of all groups, races, and genders are subject to the same laws of natural selection. Another theory that he had was that the weak didn't succeed along with their culture, but the strong prospered and became powerful along with their culture. This theory doesn't take into account how the weak became that way. It could have been from something that they couldn't control or opportunities didn't come to them. Reformed Jews believe that they are created after God and in His image, and it is their job to help improve the world. They strongly believe in the idea of including and not excluding, so they are accepting of all people and races. They fully support the equality of women and were the first religion to admit women as rabbis and presidents of the synagogue.
From the mistreatment of Native Americans to the failure of bonanza farms, the West was quite a mess during the Gilded Age. Bonanza farms were humongous farms that produced crops and relied on advanced machinery and hundreds of workers to make a profit. Usually the farms were bought by companies or wealthy men. The problem with these types of farms was that when the price of wheat, or whatever crop the farm was growing at the time, fell, it became very hard for the owner to pay all his workers, maintain the expensive machinery, and turn a profit. This setback led to the failure of bonanza farms, and led to many of the farms being split up into smaller individually run ones. These farms did not require as many crops each month to return a profit. The Black Hills War is a great example of the mistreatment of the natives. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 gave the Cheyenne tribe a large portion of South Dakota to be used as a reservation for them. Part of the guaranteed land was the Black Hills. These hills were rumored to have gold in them, and in the 1874 expedition led by George Custer, they found gold. This led to thousands of miners flooding the area in search of gold. President Grant realized it was in his interest to secure the right to these hills, to avoid conflict with the natives and give miners the access to the gold. But when the natives refused to give up their land, Grant threatened them with war. When once again they refused to give up their land, which was promised to them in a treaty with the United States just a few years earlier. Grant then sent troops and a war ensued. Both sides lost hundreds, and the war is often remembered for the Battle of Little Bighorn, a strategic failure for American forces, a battle in which almost half the American forces ended up as casualties, including General Custer, who died in the battle. Although in the end the U.S. won the war, they suffered many losses and broke a treaty they had signed just a few years earlier with the natives. The West in the late 1800s was indeed a Gilded Age.
The Gilded Age was an era after the Civil War that was marked by tremendous economic growth but also horrible political corruption. The economic growth did not outweigh the political corruption. It was not a golden age because the prosperity was corrupt and deceptive and hence gilded. The 19th century Industrial Revolution had created new powerful corporations uncontrolled by the democratic process. The result of this new powerful corporate system was a society that was controlled by special interests. Groups of men who lobbied legislators for special favors for corporations. Some lobbyists had as much influence over the political system as elected officials. Many politicians were accountable to the special interest groups because the corporation interests and the legislators' interests were often the same. For example, politicians often held stock in companies, allowing the politicians to make laws that economically benefited them. The presidential leadership of the Gilded Age was weak and corrupt. The presidency of Ulysses S. Grant was marred by many political scandals such as the Credit Mobilier scandal, Black Friday, and the Whiskey Ring. James G. Blaine was a member of Congress who was involved in the Credit Mobilier. Mugwumps were liberal Republicans who withdrew their support for James G. because of his many corruption scandals. He was a Republican candidate in 1876. The Mugwumps moved their support to Grover Cleveland and helped him win the election. After the Civil War, there was a large amount of greenbacks, which was paper money in circulation that was not backed by gold or silver. Under the Funding Act of 1866, the circulation of greenbacks was reduced to 356 million. By 1872, the amount was raised to 382 million. After President Grant vetoed the Information Bill, the circulation of greenback was permanently raised to 400 million. The Resumption Act of 1857 attempted to do away with the greenbacks and return to the gold and silver standard, and replaced all paper coins that were less than $1 with silver coins. The Greenback Party did not agree with this, stating that paper money would allow more funds to be available for investment and that paper money would also give the government more control over money supply. The Greenback Party did not want that to happen. The Resumption Act of 1875 passed, but it did not have much of an effect because the Greenback Party continued to raise greenbacks, and once they raised enough greenbacks, the public discontinued the rush to redeem, and greenbacks became the acceptable currency. Compulsory education for school-aged children was an attempt to improve the education of the common people during the 18th century. Children who attended school could not work and help to support their families at the same time. Therefore, if children were to continue with school, parents had to find a way to support them. Congress in many states began to establish committees to investigate the relationship between labor and corporations. Many laws that were passed attempted to resolve the conflicts between labor and capital. The Granger Laws were laws passed in southern states to regulate prices of grain and end discrimination against farmers. In 1877, in Mum versus Illinois, the state of Illinois created a law that eliminated railroad rate discrimination. The Supreme Court found this law constitutional. The Railroad Safety Act regulated safety for train brakes. Although it appeared as if the Supreme Court was willing to accept laws regulating corporations for the public good. Several years later, in Wabash versus Illinois, the court reversed the decision in Mum versus Illinois, stating that states could not regulate railroads. The Supreme Court agreed with corporations in almost every case after that. Senator George Pendleton of Ohio sponsored the Service Reform Act, or the Pendleton Act of 1883. This was an act that enforced a merit system that guaranteed that federal employment candidates would have a way to compete for federal jobs without needing political connections. Prior to this act, jobs were given to individuals through political connections. The Civil Service Commission would administer the test. The Civil Service Act resulted in politicians' dependence on donations from business interests because money raised from political appointees helped to fund political parties.
Late 19th century America, a period often referred to as the Gilded Age, exhibited a country caught in two social extremes. Despite some leaps and improvements, it can be seen that the positives were isolated in different parts of the country. Such disproportional success is the reason why this era in time is known as the Gilded Age. With monstrous increases in agricultural resources, coal, and railroad production, men such as John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie monopolized the United States. The Gilded Age also saw heavy increases in unemployment, poverty, violence, and racial tension. This is what separated the country from being labeled as golden. Many lives were lost in violent protests and strikes against pay cuts, unemployment, and labor laws. One such outbreak lasted through the summer of 1877 when railroads began to decrease work weeks to only 2 or 3 days and cut wages in increments of 10%. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 saw violence break out across the country in many cities such as Baltimore, Kansas City, and Pittsburgh as the railroad laborers protested the larger companies. Many of the new labor forces began to discriminate among members in society and push towards racial violence as a means to eradicate competition for the common jobs popping up across the country. The Knights of Labor excluded bankers, doctors, lawyers, stockholders, and liquor manufacturers because they were deemed unproductive members of society. This organization was responsible for many violent protests. Among those labor-oriented, like the Haymarket Strike of 1886, were race riots, including the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, which caused the deaths of 28 Chinese Americans, and the Thibodaux Massacre in Louisiana, which led to the deaths of an estimated 50 African American sugarcane workers. The Knights of Labor also strongly supported black segregation in the South and laws that inhibited the rights of Chinese immigrants, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Contract Labor Law of 1855. Destruction also occurred at inspiration from political leaders such as Eugene Debs, who, prior to his many presidential campaigns as a leader of the Socialist Party, orchestrated the Pullman strike on railroad cars, leading to even more innocent deaths. Such an uneven distribution of wealth in society, as well as the many chaotic resistances and racial skirmishes popping up throughout the country, contributed to a period of time in America that should definitely be described as gilded, not golden.